Hello, everybody. Douglas V. Gibbs here, Mr. Constitution. So I arrive at my Constitution class in Chino on Monday night, and during the drive, I did not have the radio on. I was in thought and thinking about different things I needed to do and so on and so forth. And the first words out of everybody's mouth is, well, Doug, what do you think? I'm like, what do I think about what? Well, Trump's home in Florida just got raided by the FBI. Now, I expect the left to do some low and dirty things. It doesn't surprise me when they do these types of things. But this really took the cake. This is going beyond. And not that I'm surprised, but it's unbelievable what they did. So, of course, me being Mr. Constitution, the first question is, well, where's the constitutionality? Where's the unconstitutionality? So let's examine that. So here's the headlines. Regime raid on Trump and outrage. 4 questions after FBI raids Trump's home. GOP lawmakers vow probe of FBI raid of Trump's Mar-A-Lago. And Mar-A-Lago raid on Trump is shameful political hit job. Now, the Founding Fathers were aware of political factions, and that's what they called them. Political parties didn't exist at the time of the writing of the Constitution. Political factions, difference of opinions, all that did. And what they had seen in history is the political factions just about tear apart Britain during the 1600s. A series of civil wars. And that was one of the reasons why they did things in the Constitution to, number one, cut down the influence of that type of shenanigans. And number two, we're not a democracy. Because when there's a democracy and there's mob rule and you can convince the people to do certain things, the mob at the political level, the factions, then they really play the political games. They do this kind of stuff because they're trying to convince certain parts of the population to vote for them or to not vote for another person. They wanted to avoid the devastation that was caused by the political factions battling, but they also recognized that political disagreement is a part of the system. We naturally do it. George Washington, in his farewell address after his second term as president of the United States, he had seen what political factions had done in his own administration. By 1790, both Hamilton and Jefferson had left his cabinet so they could battle it out with their new parties. Hamilton had created what was called the Federalist Party, which the only thing Federalist about it was his name, a big government party. And Jefferson, a more laissez-faire, a more small, limited government party that appealed more to the farmers, while Hamilton appealed to the merchants and the big businesses and the bankers and things like that. And so they began to battle it out. And the division in the country was immediately noticeable. This is the kind of thing that goes on. And so political division, political parties going at it, this is something they understood. So they tried to take precautions to limit the powers of these parties, these factions. Now, once again, during his farewell address, George Washington warned against it. John Adams warned against it, said this two-party system is going to tear this country apart. Jefferson early on warned about it. Now, James Madison, while he argued that political factions are dangerous, it's not good, he also argued that it's a natural thing. It's a natural tendency that political systems do. In Federalist Paper number 10, Madison wrote that one of the functions of a well-constructed union should be its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. So he recognized the problem. Jefferson ultimately conceded that Madison was correct in the natural tendencies of humans to form organized political factions. Men and their constitutions are naturally divided into two parties, he wrote in 1824. Those words that George Washington said during his farewell address in 1796, as I indicated earlier, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. The battle between parties got so bad that the Federalist Party dominated Congress, and John Adams, as president, eventually they passed a Sedition Act that basically made it illegal to speak out against the government, the administration, what they were doing. Now, they used the excuse of the Tories, but it was really to seize control, hold on to control. Now, once Jefferson took over after his win in 1800 with a friendly Jeffersonian Republican Congress, Jefferson made sure that at least half of the federal employees were fired, keeping only clerks and customs agents. Now, while the Federalist Party retreated to the courts. They packed the court. They literally packed the entire court system. created new circuit courts, new district courts, justices of the peace. They divided Washington, D.C. into a couple of counties with the Organic Act of 1801. They did everything they could to get as many court positions filled with Federalists because they knew they had lost the Congress, both houses, they had lost the presidency. And so, as Jefferson said, the opposition has retreated to the stronghold of the courts where it will be more difficult to dislodge them. Now, Jefferson made sure that at least half of the federal employees were fired, the top half. And when he did so, he committed so much destruction against the Federalist Party, they had nothing but the courts. And by the 1820s, the Federalists couldn't even win an election, even locally. And so the Federalist Party literally vanished. It just faded into obscurity in the annals of history. Eventually, the two-party system reemerged. The Whig Party came up as the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, became the Democratic Republicans under Andrew Jackson, and ultimately the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party then started pushing democracy and firm union and things like that, and the power of the executive. And so the Whigs kind of emerged with the power of the legislature being the stronger part of government and being a little bit closer to what Jefferson had originally intended. And then the war over slavery inside the Whig Party launched, and it destroyed the party from within, and the pro-slavery Whigs wound up going to the Democratic Party or to other smaller parties. And then in 1854, today's Republican Party was created, the Grand Old Party, the Republican Party. And then they put up their presidential candidate in 1856, and he didn't win. And then in 1860, he did win, Abraham Lincoln, first Republican president. And the purpose of the Republican Party at the time was to abolish slavery. I don't know if Lincoln necessarily agreed with that fully, but that's a story for a different time. But the two-party faction system, once again, was in play, and it was the two parties that we now have today. And I bring all of this up because this is what caused what just happened. This is what led to this move against Mar-A-Lago, this political disagreement, the parties. And there's a lot of people say, well, we need to get rid of the parties. Well, as Madison said, we naturally do it. I mean, if we were to get rid of parties, hypothetically, just got rid of them, then you got a candidate come up or an issue come up, and those who support, those who are against, they're against. The birds of a feather flock together, they organize, they choose leaders, boom, you got your parties. We naturally do it. That's what Madison was trying to explain. So we can't get rid of them, so we got to figure out a way to control them, to take the teeth out of what they do, or the bite, to control this kind of activity, this kind of tyranny that they committed, for example, against a former president of the United States. We've got now the Democrat Party using the FBI as basically their secret police, as a law enforcement arm. And now that brings up a question. Why does the FBI exist? And is it constitutional? Because the fact is, when it came to the raid, whether or not it's constitutional is not the point, because the premise is messed up. So, did they have the authority to raid Mar-A-Lago? Well, if a judge did sign a warrant for a search, and they had specific items they're looking for, a specific location they're looking to search through and all of that, then a law enforcement agency could, it's a reasonable search and seizure if there's a warrant and a description of the things to be searched and seized, and their location is in the warrant, or their possible location, then that makes it legal. But the question is, could the FBI carry out that warrant? And if the FBI is operating in Florida, did they have to, get permission from the sheriff, the county sheriff? Absolutely. But it goes even deeper than that. It goes even farther than that. So let's back up. Let's go a little deeper, but first let's talk about a little history again. So during the 1880s, the Fabian Society, the socialists, emerged in Britain. By 1890, they were heavily influential on American politics. American politics was moving in a socialist direction. And in fact, both political parties proudly considered themselves, quote-unquote, progressive socialists. Theodore Roosevelt, Republican, 1801 to 1809 president, claimed to be our first progressive president. He was proudly progressive. progressive era led to the adoption, the creation of the Federal Reserve Act, the 16th Amendment, which regarding taxation, the 17th Amendment, which changed how the United States Senate is populated, and all three moves were designed to move America away from its Republican form of government to make it more of a democracy, and to provide mechanisms that would allow the wealthy and the powerful elites more easily to manipulate the federal government's puppet strings. During that time, in 1908, at the tail end of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, the FBI was formed. And this is once again, he's a proud progressive, despite his Republican Party affiliation. And there were arguments over executive authority. Now, Theodore Roosevelt argued he viewed the president as the steward of the people, and that the president should take whatever action necessary for the public good unless expressly forbidden by law or the Constitution. I do not usurp power, he wrote, but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power. Basically, what he was saying was he broadened the power of the executive branch of government because he did things and didn't get stopped. Woodrow Wilson said of the Constitution that it was not made to fit us like a straitjacket. In its elasticity lies its chief greatness. He can stretch it, bend it any way he wanted. That was his attitude. He called our Constitution a living Constitution, Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. All the progressives ask or desires permission in an era when development, evolution is the scientific word, to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. Woodrow Wilson also said the old theory of the sovereignty of the states, which used so to engage our passions, has lost its vitality. The war between the states established at least this principle, that the federal government is, through its courts, the final judge of its own powers. We are impatient of state legislatures because they seem to us less representative of the thoughtful opinion of the country than Congress is. We know that our legislatures do not think alike, but we are not sure that our people do not think alike. What Woodrow Wilson was basically saying is if the federal government wants to create something, they want to do something, doesn't matter what the states think, it's constitutional because they decided to do it. And he has a quote that says essentially that if the president does anything he wants and the Congress doesn't stop him, it's constitutional. So the creation of the FBI in 1908 under Theodore Roosevelt, progressive, and the continuation of the use of it through people like Taft and Woodrow Wilson. Taft was an economic conservative, but not necessarily in other things. The FBI became the law enforcement arm domestically of the federal government. It evolved into this, and we see these movies, right, with Ness and these different people, and how the FBI, they were the good guys, and they were stewards of sacred honor and honest and so on and so forth. Now they're being used as the secret police. But the question is now, if we cannot figure out specifically based on all kinds of factors whether or not the raid on Mar-A-Lago was constitutional, then we must ask, was the agency used constitutional? This is where it gets interesting. On January 4th, 1642, King Charles I, with a group of armed men, burst into the British House of Commons to arrest 5 of his most vocal critics for treason. The king climbed into the speaker's chair, surveyed the chamber, and declared, "I see the birds have flown." He then commanded Speaker William Linthal to disclose their location. The speaker reportedly fell to his knees and responded, "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here." Fearing for his life, the king fled London, followed by some loyalist members, established an alternative parliament in Oxford, and began raising an army. A civil war ensued between the royalists and the parliamentarians. The parliamentarians eventually won in 1646, and 2 years later, Charles was executed as a traitor. I bring this up because what we saw happen at Mar-A-Lago happened in history back in the 1600s. That's an example of it happening. The Founding Fathers were aware of these types of possibilities. That's why they wrote certain things in the Constitution to try to stop these kinds of shenanigans. The rights and privileges of Parliament were violated by the king when he broke into the lower chamber. The privileges and immunities of a legislative body, the principle of which are the freedoms from arrest, now seems like are largely obsolete. The freedom of speech date back to the 17th century mother of parliaments. They were established to protect the parliament against intrusions by the king and others on the body's ability to carry out its business. So in the Constitution, we have clauses that say such a thing. Article 1, Section 6. The senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for the services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. They shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house they shall not be questioned in any other place. This was designed to keep their political enemies from arresting them on their way to Congress so that they couldn't vote, or the president acting as a king saying, well, you said this in Congress, now I'm going to question you and we're going to tear you up because that was against me or something. That clause gives Congress privileges and immunities to operate as they need to operate without intrusion. The same goes in the other direction, though. Congress also cannot intrude upon the privileges and immunities of the president in such a way, especially when it comes to political antics. I am not saying that there are no checks. I'm not saying that if someone is doing something horrible, they can't be arrested or they can't be made to face the consequences for something. But it's not for Congress or the president to be arresting each other and things like that. That's not what it's for. And to have an agency that is investigating other persons in government or other people that may or may not have influenced government, be it J6 or be it President Trump in this raid, or be it, and you'll like this one, and understand this happened immediately, like the next day after what they did to Trump's house. Breaking: Joe Biden's FBI apprehends GOP representative while traveling with family and seizes his phone after raiding President Trump's home the night before. After raiding President Trump's home at Mar-A-Lago, the Stasi FBI detained Representative Scott Perry and seized his phone. Turns out Perry is a staunch Trump supporter. The Gateway Pundit says it is now open season on conservatives and patriotic Americans. The government has declared war on the American people. I've got a friend who says, there's going to be a flashpoint. There's going to be a moment where people aren't going to put up with this stuff anymore. They're going to go too far, and it's going to cause a problem. I agree, that's a possibility. But we also must remember what it says in the Declaration of Independence before we go jump in to grab our guns and shoot the place up and all this other stuff. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on the principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem more likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, here's the part I want you to really pay close attention to. This is a part that we need to be aware of. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. In other words, if it's bad, you try to do it within, you don't try to abolish it, you try to fix it. And you tolerate what you got to tolerate. But there's a point where they cross the line. You can't tolerate it anymore. Then it says, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Okay, Doug, that's great, but you didn't answer the question. Is the FBI constitutional? That's the grand finale. Let's talk about that. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, where in the Constitution does it give the federal government the authority to have a law enforcement arm like the FBI? We have to remember that despite what Woodrow Wilson had to say, there is something called the enumeration doctrine. The enumeration doctrine is something that the founding fathers believed in. They instilled in the Constitution that basically says that in order to have an authority, the federal government must be given expressly enumerated the power in the U.S. Constitution. If it's not there, they don't have it. 10th Amendment is a part of that, right? What does the 10th Amendment say? The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. In other words, powers are delegated to the federal government. And if they're not delegated, they don't have the power. And if that same power is not prohibited to the states have that authority, not the federal government. So documents such as Federalist Paper number 45 by James Madison, speeches by James Madison, writings by Thomas Jefferson argue that the clauses delegating the powers authorized the federal government must be understood narrowly so as to keep the federal government within the boundaries of the enumeration. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to Albert Gallatin, dated June 16, 1817, referring to the political chasm between Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party and his own Jeffersonian Republicans, explained the tenet that Congress has only the power to provide for enumerated powers and not for the general welfare is almost the only landmark which now divides the Federalists from the Republicans. In other words, the enumeration powers exist. And that's about the only thing that both parties agree on. James Madison, in a speech during the Virginia Ratification Convention to defend the enumeration doctrine against misinterpretations of the Necessary and Proper Clause, June 16, 1788, explained the Necessary and Proper Clause was construed to cover only those instrumental or administrative activities too numerous and detailed to be included in a Constitution that were strictly necessary for the accomplishment of the powers enumerated in clauses 2 through 17. In other words, the powers are enumerated, and any power that's not enumerated used by the federal government must be necessary and proper in order to carry out an enumerated power. Okay, so first of all, does the federal government have the enumerated power of having a law enforcement arm? No. Is it necessary and proper in order to have an FBI to execute the laws of the United States? They are under the executive branch. Department of Justice, FBI. FBI is under the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is basically a bunch of prosecutors. But if they need to investigate, if they need a law enforcement arm, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives them that. Well, how about executing the laws of the United States? Because, executive branch, the president has the executive power. It does say in Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen for the same term be elected as follows, and it goes into the Electoral College. So the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. So executing the laws of the United States is an authority of the federal government. Is the president expected to do it himself? No. Well, then he's going to need an agency to do it. Someone would argue, gosh, Doug, wouldn't that be things like the Border Patrol or the FBI or the ATF or the FDA or any other agency that's there to enforce the laws of the United States? Well, first of all, are those laws constitutional in the first place? Remember, when the Constitution was first written, in Article 1, Section 4, it says that Congress shall meet at least one time per year, and there were actually those in the convention that said, whoa, once per year is too often. There's no authorities when it comes to domestic stuff. Our authorities are external, so unless we're at war, what are we going to do? But there are some authorities that are internal. Establishing a post office, for example. And so, what if the federal government does need to execute a law? Maybe a tax. After all, we had the Whiskey Rebellion, right? It was a tax on whiskey and people weren't paying for it. And so Washington showed up. Did he bring an agency? Did he have an FBI with him? Did he have a whiskey agency? The Federal Whiskey Administration? No. Who did he have with him when he went down there to, Kentucky, was South Pennsylvania at the time, to take care of the Whiskey Rebellion? Who went with him? Who went with President Washington? Members of the militia. Congress had called up the militia to join him for this. So now let's get back to the question. The federal government has the authority to make certain laws. If those laws need to be executed domestically, the executive authority of the president gives him that ability. But what mechanism is he going to use to execute the laws of the United States? If he's not allowed an FBI and an FDA and an ATF and all these other things, then who is going to execute the laws of the United States domestically? The answer is in Article 1, Section 8. In Article 1, Section 8, you'll notice that all of the clauses there begin with the word to, except for the very first one. The first one says the Congress shall have the power to. So the Congress shall have power those 5 words come before each of these twos. And what it says about halfway down, Article 1, Section 8, is that the Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union. So the militia, the state militia, is supposed to exist, is supposed to be in play. All of the states should have a militia. Right now, only 24 states do. And that is the mechanism the federal government can use to execute domestic federal law, the militia. Now, when we read the Second Amendment, well-regulated militia, and we know that we're all a part of that militia, but what they're referring to here is the organized militia. There's an organized, there's an unorganized. In U.S. Code, Title 10, Subtitle A, Section 246, Militia, Composition, and Classes, the U.S. Code actually delineates between the organized and the unorganized militia. The organized militia being the National Guard, the Naval Militia, and the other militias that exist. And the unorganized militia would consist of the members of the militia who are not members of the National Guard or the Naval Militia. Well, who are the members of the militia that are not a part of that? The unorganized militia that's you and I. We are the unorganized militia. So well-regulated militia being necessary to carry out or for the security of the free state. I mean, gosh, George Mason was asked, well, gosh, Mr. Mason, what's a militia? George Mason responded, it is the whole people except for a few public officials. Even then, they didn't trust all of the politicians. So, the militia is supposed to execute the laws of the United States. There's no authority for an FBI. There's no authority for most of these agencies. The federal government's not supposed to have a policing arm. They're not supposed to even have very many laws domestically. There's no need for a law enforcement arm or a policing arm in the federal government because they're not a national government. They're not the rulers over all of us here in this country. Their job is the external issues. Federalist Paper number 45, James Madison explains that the federal government's powers are few and defined. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last, the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. The operation of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those of the state governments in times of peace and security. So if there needs to be some investigating, get the sheriff, get the people who handle things locally, whatever. Get the warrants that way. But the FBI is an unconstitutional agency. It's not supposed to exist. And yet they're being used as the Hitleric secret police by this current administration. We have the FBI raiding a former president's home, searching for papers they allege he has. They found nothing. And then they seize the phone of a United States representative while he's with his family the next day. This is the kind of stuff that tyrants do. This is the kind of things that Stalin did and Lenin did and Hitler did. Mussolini did. Mao did. Pol Pot did. Castro did. and Venezuela's Chavez did. These are the actions of tyrants. And the Founding Fathers did not allow the federal government to have these kinds of powers and authorities for exactly this reason, so that it could not act in such a tyrannical manner. We have a federal government, not a national government. This government is not the king over everything. We don't have a monarchy. We don't have a national government. We have a federal government with limited authorities that must be enumerated in the Constitution, and the FBI is not enumerating the Constitution. And this type of activity against a former president by federal agencies of this nature is not constitutional either. All of this screams in the face of the Constitution. All of this defies what the Constitution, the principles of the Constitution is all about. And this is exactly the kind of government, as the meme likes to say, that the founders were warning you about. This is the kind of thing they were trying to avoid by giving all of the oversight mechanisms to the states, and by making sure we don't have a democracy and we don't have a national government that just controls everything. Unlike what Woodrow Wilson had to say, the state's sovereignty, having oversight over everything the federal government did, was important and key. I don't care if they think, well, the government's got to progress and evolve into a tyranny. No. The point, and for those who want to argue, well, it's antiquated. No, it's not. Liberty is not antiquated. They understood, they being the Founding Fathers, what utopianism, their word for communism, socialism, tyranny, fascism, all of that, they understood what that was. They wrote the Constitution to avoid that stuff, and we're not following it. We have gone so far from the Constitution, as I like to say, we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not even on the yellow brick road anymore. We're on some dirt road behind Emerald City. And we need to get this fixed. We need to get back to the Constitution. This was uncalled for. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. And the FBI should be disbanded. Not only because it's unconstitutional, but because it's being used as this administration's secret police. Who's next? What's next? When do they begin arresting private citizens for daring to speak out against the Democrats? When does it stop? Now, I'm going to tell you right now, these guys are like bullies in the schoolyard. See, they want to poke you in the chest and poke you in the chest until you react. Then they say, well, teacher, he threw the first punch. I was just poking him. That's what they want. They back down unless you react in a way that they want. Bundy Canyon, they backed down. Remember, the FBI didn't advance, they backed down. Of course, later on, then they executed Lavoy Finicum up there in the snow of Oregon. Because that's how they are as bullies. They do things while you're not looking, or kind of as a side shot. But when everybody's watching, there's a big crowd, they back down. 2014, Marietta, remember the buses coming in with the illegal aliens? I was a part of that. What did we eventually do right around the 4th of July? We blocked the road and didn't let the buses in. Did they shoot us? Did they arrest us? No, they turned the buses around and the buses stopped coming in. Unless we cross the line, they will back down. So we need to do this prudently, carefully, peacefully. But we need to get back to the Constitution. But I'm going to tell you what, people are getting frustrated. This keeps going on. There will be a flashpoint if we're not careful. All right, thanks for watching. United we stand, combined we kick butt. God bless America. God bless you. I have a store, douglasvgibbs.com/store. Buy my books. I have 8 of them. I have t-shirts, all kinds of stuff. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Subscribe to this video. Subscribe to my channel. Be it any of them. And I do have a number of channels. Check them all out. Subscribe to all of them. Because I put videos when I can on all of these channels. They all kind of have their own reason for existing. This channel where this is at, this is about constitutional issues regarding the political world as it is going on today. So once again, thanks for watching. I am Mr. Constitution Douglas V. Gibbs, and we'll see you next time. Be safe.